So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Colorful History of Tartan with Melissa Weaver Dunning. Loudoun County Public Library is pleased to be partnering with the Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge to bring you this program tonight. I'm Lorraine Moffa, Programming Coordinator at Loudoun County Public Library and your host for the program. Please feel free to share with me your comments and questions for the speaker by typing them in the chat box. I can then relay them to Melissa at the end of her presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce Melissa Weaver Dunning. She is a traditional hand weaver and spinner with 40 years of experience working on antique equipment to produce 18th and 19th century style textiles. Melissa began her traditional textile study with Scottish master weaver Norman Kennedy and carries on this rich tradition in her own teaching. Melissa is an avid tartan and linen weaver and a lover of wool who loves sharing her passion for weaving and spinning with her students. Welcome back, Melissa.
Hi, thanks for having me back again.
Love having you.
So this is a program that I put together to give for tartan weaving classes that I teach and also for weavers guilds, particularly in the last year and a half. But the story is interesting enough that I think it will be appealing to a general audience as well. But we are going to see a lot of cloth, but it's going to be very colorful. So we're going to start with a painting that was made by David Allen in 1780 called The Highland Wedding at Blair Atoll. And you can see some tartan trousers. There's the older man on the left is wearing a tartan sash. There's a woman with a plaid over her head. And we see the young man dancing is wearing tartan trews or trousers, which would have been woven fabric cut on the bias for as much stretch as possible and fitted absolutely skin tight. But it was the fashion in these days for men to show their legs to good effect. And we won't talk about the fellow behind him in the blue coat because I think he's had a bit much to drink. So I want to start with a quote from James Scarlett from his book called Tartan, the Highland Textile. Tartan is an art form of considerable antiquity, which owes much of its beauty and liveliness to the interplay of color and the action of light and sight along and across the diagonal ribs of the twill weave that is traditionally used in making the cloth. And I particularly want to note his statement that it is an art form of considerable antiquity, which is pretty vague. And there's a reason for that. We don't really know how old tartan cloth is. Here we have a map of Scotland showing the Highlands and the Lowlands, and tartan is definitely a Highland cloth. So you can see the general area in which it was woven. Tartan is what we call plaid in the United States. It's an ancient design for cloth that has become the national symbol of Scotland. No other type of cloth has been embraced with such fervor or subjected to legal prohibition. It is a delight to weave and has a fascinating history, and that is what I'm here to share with you today. Tartan cloth has been woven for centuries, but no one really knows when the earliest tartans were woven. For many years, a scrap of checked twill cloth found in a jar of Roman coins was thought to be the oldest tartan, and we're looking now at that scrap. It's referred to as the Falkirk tartan. But more recent discoveries have yielded tartan fabric back as far as 1200 BC, with tartan fabric found on mummified bodies of Caucasians in Urumqi in China. And this is a piece of the Chinese cloth, and then a reproduction to the right by a modern weaver. Tartan scraps have also been found in Celtic salt mines in Hallstatt in Germany. This is where the Chinese fabric was found. And this is the Hallstatt tartan in Austria. The Falkirk tartan was found in a jar of old Roman coins that was buried in Britain in about 230 AD. And this is a modern interpretation of the Hallstatt tartan. Now, the problem here is that cloth is notoriously fragile. And so what we have dating way back or at least back into the Greeks, are words about cloth that may or may not be tartan. And I've just shown you some of the oldest pieces of fabric that are found, but as you can imagine, the fabric does not hold up very well. So in 100 BC, the Greek historian Siculus wrote, "The way the Celts dress is astonishing. They wear brightly colored and embroidered shirts with trousers called bracae and cloaks fastened at the shoulder with a brooch, heavy in winter, light in summer. These cloaks are striped or checkered in design, with the separate checks close together and in various colors." Sounds to the modern ear like a description of tartan, but we can't be entirely sure. Around 50 BC, Marcus Terentius Varro mentioned cloth woven of diverse colors, and Virgil wrote of the Celts in his Aeneid, "Their cloaks are striped and shining," and Titus Livius refers to flaming colored dresses. Words like marled, striped, variegated, and of diverse colors are used, but the word tartan does not appear in print until 1355 among the expenses of John, Lord of the Isles, Unus Caligarum Bracatarum de Terra Titana, which has been translated as one pair of tartan trews, or trousers. The word tartan comes from the French word tartan, which originally referred to a specific type of cloth of no particular color. Think of the word denim, which describes the fabric, but not necessarily the color of that fabric. So these trews could have been made of tartan fabric rather than tartan patterned fabric. This is an image from the Recueil de la Diversité des Habits of 1562, and it's a record of the variety of clothing that people of different nationalities and small cultural groups wear. And this book can be seen in its entirety online at the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris. And this particular slide, I have two images from that book that relate to Scotland. This is La Sauvage d'Écosse, which is a wild Scottish woman. And she appears to be wearing a furs, like a fur cloak. And the second image is of Le Capitaine Sauvage. So this is the male warrior from Scotland. And at first glance, I thought he was holding a chainsaw. But in fact, that is an embellished scabbard for his sword. He has a targe, a rounded shield, and he's carrying a variety of other things. And he does look quite sauvage, quite wild. And his cloak, which at first glance I would take for, say, cabled knitting, although that's not very appropriate for our wild warrior here, may possibly be just a herringbone weave cloth. That may be what the artist intended. But these are interesting images. The Gaelic word for tartan is brecon, which comes from brec, meaning checkered or variegated. In 1538, the treasurer to King James V mentions Highland Tartan, and in a German etching of Scottish soldiers in 1582, George Buchanan wrote in his Rerum Scoticorum Historia, "They delight in variegated garments, especially striped, and their favorite colors are purple and blue." 1594, there are two mentions of tartan kilts worn by Scots soldiers. The Hebrideans were recognized among the Irish soldiers for the distinction of their arms and clothing, their habits and language, for their exterior dress was mottled cloaks of many colors. And finally, their uppermost garment is a loose cloak of several ells, striped and party-colored, which they gird breadthwise with a leather belt, so as it scarce covers the knees, which is a perfect description of a Scottish greatkilt. Now, here we have a fellow wearing a short jacket with a cloak, and I just want to point out that there's a line on his legs that is known to have been added by the Victorians in order to make it appear as though he's wearing trousers, when in fact, he is not. So here we have a typical Highland Bagpiper. This is an old etching. And the next one, we've got a man wearing a greatkilt and wearing a short coat over that. And you see the length of his kilt hanging at the back, but the front shows how he has it belted. So that extra length could be worn hanging loose at the back, up over the shoulder and pinned with a brooch, or over the head as a cloak to protect you from the weather. So depending on what your needs were and the weather. And here he is with the larger, longer upper part brought up over his shoulders like a cloak. So you get an idea, this piece of fabric and how it might be used. And here we have another old etching that's been hand colored. And these fellows are meant to be of the same regiment and wearing matching tartans. And they're both wearing a great kilt. They've just got the upper part up over their shoulders. And one more of Highland chiefs who are wearing two distinctly different tartans. And I'll mention that the leggings they're wearing are not knitted stockings. Knitting had a relatively late introduction into this part of the world. And what they're wearing would have been woven and turned on the bias, just as for the tartan trews, so that your squares become diamonds, turned that way. And they're probably just leggings without any feet. They would last longer that way. Many people were accustomed to going barefoot, or they weren't accustomed to wearing socks or stockings. That would have come quite a bit later. Okay, so here we have a Highland spinner. She's using a traditional Scottish spindle, which has a couple of different names. And she is spinning long wool from a distaff. And I just want to mention for the spinners out there that in some cases, in many cases, this type of spindle would be referred to as a drop spindle. And I believe the word drop is an interpretation or a translation of suspended. But in this case, she's using a type of spindle that is never released from the hand. And I refer to this as a grasp spindle. So she works the spindle with her fingers. She doesn't release it. She merely moves her spindle hand away from her fiber source as she's spinning her string, her yarn. And then she stops and winds it onto the spindle and starts again close to the distaff and moves that spindle arm away. But she never releases her spindle, at least not intentionally. And here we have another spinner also using a grasp spindle. She's probably spinning linen in this image, but you get the idea of the posture of the spinner. Her distaff is either thrust into a hole in the bench or kind of tucked under her armpit to hold it in place. And here we have a warp weighted loom. And on this type of loom, the warp is attached to the upper bar, and then a couple of little details to create sheds to move half the threads forward or backward to help you with the weaving. And the length of the piece is not limited by the size of the loom, because the excess is wrapped around whatever type of weights you have. In this case, these look like stones, but we'll also see some sort of donut-shaped warp weights in another slide. And as you weave, the finished cloth can be rolled over the beam at the top and the weights at the bottom adjusted. So you could make quite a long piece. So the filet mort, or great kilt, would have been woven on a vertical or warp weighted loom, as we see here, using wool that was combed, dressed on a distaff, and spun by a hand spindle to make a smooth, hard, thin, worsted type yarn. Not a fuzzy, woolly kind of sweater yarn, but more like the kind of wool used for men's worsted suits. The fabric for a single great kilt was approximately 60 inches wide and 5 yards long. So the loom we're looking at now, the proportions of it, it would have been at least 60 inches wide, and the warp there would be 5 yards long, quite a bit wound on the stones at the bottom. And here we have some old loom weights. So depending on the kind of materials you had available, you might use smooth stones, or you might be able to find stones of this shape, or have a place you could put them, or have someone who could drill them. So different varieties of items were used for weights. And here we have a picture of a man donning a great kilt, how to wear the belted plaid. This expansive cloth was pleated together lengthwise and belted at a man's waist, with the excess thrown up over one shoulder and pinned in place. In foul weather, the end of the kilt was unpinned and could be worn over the head as a cloak, or at night, the kilt was unbelted and used as a blanket. And generally speaking, I've heard the description that you would put your belt on the ground and lay the kilt over it. And I have to think that sometimes people must have helped each other into their kilts to avoid putting your whole kilt on the wet ground. So here we have the first of the images from the artist R.R. McKeon, who between the years of 1845 and 1848 illustrated some 70 figures in traditional forms of Highland dress. Some are more fanciful than historical, and these were made for inclusion in The Clans of the Scottish Highlands, a book by James Logan. His portraits have become some of the best recognized depictions of Scottish Highland dress across the globe, and we'll see quite a few of these later on during the lecture. In 1618, John Taylor wrote in The Penniless Pilgrimage of Highland Dress that it was of a warm stuff of diverse colors, which they call tartan. In 1691, James Philip penned an epic poem in Latin, I will not read this to you, which tells in part of Glengarry's men wearing tartan that was, quote, woven with Phrygian skill in triple stripe, and of his brother having 100 men, all clothed in garments interwoven with the red stripe. Phrygian, in this case, would mean antique. And here we have a Victorian cartoon of some women wondering the age-old question of what is worn beneath the soldier's kilt. And generally speaking, the answer to that question, or the reply, is there is nothing worn under the kilt. Everything is in perfectly good condition. But I think it's amusing that the Victorians felt it was acceptable to display this curiosity of the ladies. It's a fairly ribald cartoon. And here we have a little cartoon of a little Scottish fellow who's out on the streets on a windy, windy day. And it says, disappointing the ladies because he's wearing long underwear under his kilt. Some of them look a bit shocked, too. This is from an old postcard.
That's a great shot.
Isn't that funny?
It really is.
I'll leave you there while I say a few more things, and then we'll move on to history. One of the details that leads to the development of tartan cloth is the small dye pot. Highland sheep were small and yielded small fleeces. Water had to be carried for cooking and dyeing, and whatever washing was done, and the dyer had only a small dye pot, so they were inclined to make many small batches of different colors. A love of color and access to small amounts of color quite naturally led to the designing of tartan cloth. Locally available dye plants created some regional differences, particularly between coastal and inland communities. And now we're going to head into the Jacobites. This is a portrait of James II. English history is a complex ball of internecine rivalry, but here's the gist of the Jacobites' history. James II became King of England in 1685 upon the death of his brother Charles. While he was a popular king at first, his first wife died, and after that he married a Catholic woman, Mary of Modena, and there was great concern over her Catholic faith, and then the king converted to Catholicism. And things were heated up even more when Mary of Modena bore him a son in 1688. This is a picture of Mary and her son James III. The idea of a Catholic heir sparked great outrage and accusations that the child was not legitimate, to the extent of suggesting that he had been smuggled into the royal bedchamber in a warming pan. Later that year, James fled to safety abroad, and William of Orange and James's daughter Mary, here they are, from James's first marriage, became king and queen by an order of Parliament. And here we have James III, the baby that we saw earlier. James's supporters were called Jacobites for Jacobus, the Latin for James, while William's supporters were called Williamites. The Jacobites felt that parliamentary interference with monarchical succession was illegal. The Williamites wanted the Church of England to remain in control and were threatened by the power of the Roman Pope. There were battles fought in Ireland, the Battle of the Boyne, the Battle of Aughrim. Mary died in 1694. James II died in 1701 and was succeeded in his claim to the throne by his son, James Francis Edward Stewart. This is a portrait of Queen Anne William died in 1702 and was succeeded by Mary's sister Anne. So she, again, is a daughter from James II's first marriage. An act of Parliament decreed that the succession to the throne would pass to the House of Hanover, heirs of James I's daughter Elizabeth. In 1707, an Act of Union was signed, which made England and Scotland one nation of Great Britain. This was done in part to ensure Protestant succession for Scotland as well as England. Queen Anne died in 1714, and George of Hanover was proclaimed George I. The English monarchy came from the House of Hanover from 1714 through 1901, when it ended with the death of Queen Victoria and the reign of the House of Windsor began. This is a portrait of John Erskine, who led the first Jacobite rising in 1715. He was the Earl of Mar. After 3 months of fighting, the rebellion was quashed and its leaders jailed and some were executed. There were planned uprisings in Wales and Devon, but the only battle was briefly fought in southern Scotland, the Battle of Preston. And just for a timeline reference, in 1742, Handel's Messiah was first performed in Dublin. This is a portrait of Bonnie Prince Charlie. And I'll just note this was painted by John Petty in 1895, so clearly not from life, but after a scene in a Sir Walter Scott novel. And if any of you saw any of the Outlander series, I think the second season, the costuming and styling of the actor who played Bonnie Prince Charlie in that series was clearly modeled after this particular portrait, because it's remarkably true to this. In July of 1745, Charles Edward Stewart, also known as Bonnie Prince Charlie, and he is the grandson of James II, he landed in Scotland and gathered an army. And here we have Highlanders joining the fight. And I'll just point out here that none of the men who were lined up to go to battle are wearing the same tartan. They're wearing whatever tartans they had. Most of them probably had one great kilt, and that's what they came in. In September, they defeated the British at the Battle of Prestonpans. Charles held court at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh for 5 weeks, and then, with assurance of an English uprising, headed south into England. The Jacobite army fought as far south as Derby in England, 125 miles from London. The English Crown never expected them to get that far. And here's the Highland Army in an English village. They are dancing and gambling and buying things and probably stealing things and terrorizing the natives, but some people are making money off the situation as these things roll. They retreated into Scotland from Derby. They defeated the British army at the Battle of Falkirk in January 1746, and then they holed up for the winter. The Jacobites then met the English on the field of battle at Culloden on April 16, 1746, where they were brutally defeated. They had not enough provisions to feed the men. The men were starving. They were in ill health. What army they had left was not in any way capable of meeting the English force, in spite of their previous successes. And this battle left a quarter of the Jacobites dead on the field. This is the last battle fought on British soil. This is Maurier's painting of the Battle of Culloden, and in this, some 22 different tartans have been identified. As I said before, the men who fought with the Jacobite army wore whatever tartan they had and were identified primarily by the cockades they wore in their hat or by broom, heather, or gorse pinned to their coats. There is no evidence of a clan tartan at or before this time, 1746. And here's a stone from the Culloden battlefield, which, as you can imagine, is a monument today. And there are stones for each of the major clans that fought there as well. Okay, we'll come to this in just a second. The Act of Prescription was passed in August 1746 and included the Disarming Act and the Dress Act, Abolition and Prescription of the Highland Dress, 19 George II, Chapter 39, Section 17, 1746. That from and after the first day of August, 1746, no man or boy within that part of Britain called Scotland, other than such as shall be employed as officers and soldiers in his Majesty's forces, shall, on any pretext whatever, wear or put on the clothes commonly called Highland clothes, that is to say, the plaid, philibeg or little kilt, trews, shoulder belts, or any part whatever of what peculiarly belongs to the Highland garb, and that no tartan or party-colored plaid of stuff shall be used for greatcoats or uppercoats, and if any such person shall presume, after the said 1st day of August, to wear or put on the aforementioned garment, or any part of them, every such person so offending, for the first offence shall be liable to be imprisoned for 6 months, and on the second offence to be transported to any of his Majesty's plantations beyond the seas, there to remain for the space of 7 years. One time caught wearing tartan, you're imprisoned for 6 months, and a second time, you're transported, which essentially makes you an indentured servant or slave for 7 years. And this is a picture of Highland troops, because during the proscription, tartan was only worn by British troops. And this regiment is probably wearing the Black Watch tartan, which is one of a group of regimental tartans, and is certainly the best known of the regimental tartans. And this is a photograph of the clearances. After Culloden, there was an abrupt and violent expulsion of whole villages known as the Highland Clearances, which began in 1750, with most of the people going to North America. Landowners replaced their tenants with sheep and expected a better profit. This painting is called The Last of the Clans by Thomas Fade, and these people have been put out in the dead of winter in the snow. On the left of the painting, they're watching the roofs, the thatch roofs of their stone houses being burned, and it's a very sad and moving painting. And this is a wonderful etching I found called Lochaber No More. So two of many, many people who left Scotland to sail for North America with no real idea of where they were going or what their lives would be like there. And this is a quote that I found on the internet, but I couldn't find any ownership or authorship of it, but I'll read it to you because it's an excellent description. Whole communities were pillaged and sent into the hills for no crime other than an inability to speak English. This was 18th century ethnic cleansing with a vengeance. The tartan ban, enforced by means of the 1746 Dress Act, was a determined effort on the part of the British government to stifle rebellion, humiliate the Highlanders, and crush the power of the chiefs, and so put an end to Gaelic culture. Ironically, however, it also elevated tartan to an almost cult status. As so often is the case, the act of banning something made it seem more rather than less important, and the Highlander devised many ingenious ways of evading it. And this is what is known as a black house, and would have been the type of house with a thatch roof that we saw burning in the previous painting. And this is what people were replaced with. We love sheep, but sheep create wool and eventually tartan and tweed cloth, but people are good too and important. Okay, let me change pages. Come on. Okay. In 1765, Wilson's of Bannockburn was founded with weaving done on hand looms, and later they used steam-powered looms. In 1771, Arkwright's first cotton spinning mill opened in Derbyshire, England. The American War for Independence began in 1775 and ended in 1781. In 1782, the ban was lifted with the repeal of the act prescribing the wearing of Highland dress, 22 George III, Cap 63, 1782, and a proclamation issued in Gaelic and English announced, "Listen, men! This is bringing before all the sons of the Gael, the King and Parliament of Britain have forever abolished the act against the Highland dress, which came down to the clans from the beginning of the world to the year 1746. This must bring great joy to every Highland heart. You are no longer bound down to the unmanly dress of the Lowlander. This is declaring to every man, young and old, simple and gentle, that they may after this put on and wear the truce, the little kilt, the coat, and the strippet hose, as also the belted plaid, without fear of the law of the realm or the spite of the enemies. In 1811, the Luddites revolted in England against the increasing industrialization of their work, and in 1815, the Battle of Waterloo was fought. Sorry, I didn't mean to jump yet. And this is a portrait of the MacDonald boys. After the prescription was lifted, demand for, quote, the latest patterns and bright colors began. In 1815, Stewart of Garth and Robertson of Stewart were both corresponding about preserving the old clan sets. Scottish mills also corresponded with weaving mills in Barcelona and received pattern samples because the Galician people of the Spanish continent, the Galician people were also Celtic in origin and also wove tartan plaid patterns. This is in 1819, Wilson's Key Pattern book was published. In this book, there were no Stewart tartans, but today there are over 100 Stewart variations registered. More about that later. This is a portrait of Sir Walter Scott, who was a prolific Scottish historical novelist and poet, popular throughout Europe and the English-speaking world during his lifetime, and many of his works remain classics. His Scottish novels helped to rehabilitate the public perception of Highland culture after years in the shadow following Southern distrust of hill bandits and the Jacobite rebellions. As enthusiastic chairman of the Celtic Society of Edinburgh, he contributed to the reinvention of Scottish culture. His organization of the visit of King George IV to Edinburgh in 1822 and the spectacular pageantry that he concocted to portray George as a rather tubby reincarnation of Bonnie Prince Charlie made tartans and kilts fashionable and turned them into symbols of Scottish national identity. And thus began the first tartan craze. This is a portrait by a painter called Sir Henry Rayburn, who lived between 1756 and 1823. He was the leading Scottish portrait painter of his period, the first major Scottish painter to work largely in his own country rather than in Europe, and his portraits create a superb visual record of a golden age of culture and society in Scotland. So we start with Sir John Sinclair in this portrait. This is a wonderful portrait of Colonel Alastair Ranaldson MacDonald of Glengarry. And I just love Rayburn's use of light. They're such beautiful paintings. I hope to see them in the original, some of them someday. Okay, let me change my page. So here we have King George IV. A visit was planned for King George IV to visit Edinburgh in 1822, and Scott encouraged the clan chiefs to locate and/or invent clan tartans. Research was done by looking at old family portraits. There had been a few named tartans before this time, maybe 24, but the weaving mills were very happy to step up and provide tartans which had previously been numbered with clan names. George IV was not a popular king. When the king arrived in Edinburgh, he was met by men dressed in tartan who carried torches and ran beside the king's carriage for the 3 miles from the harbor. The crowds of Scots went wild for the sight of the men in tartan, but King George thought they were cheering for him. The king was delighted with Edinburgh and with Scotland, and for the people of Scotland, tartan fabric and the kilt were suddenly no longer the dress of northern barbarians or political dissidents. It was the respectable garb of loyal subjects. And there was also a discussion in preparation for this trip about the appropriate length of the royal kilt and how much of the royal legs should be exposed. And in the end, they decided to create some kind of flesh-colored tights to cover the king's knees. And apparently their choice of the length of his kilt was a little on the short side, because there is record of a Lady Dalrymple suggesting during the time of the king's visit that Edinburgh was seeing rather too much of the king. Now we move on to a section called Charlatans. This is an etching of the Sobieski brothers. Around the time of King George IV's visit, two Englishmen appeared in Scotland and began using the names John Sobieski Stewart and Charles Edward Stewart. They declared themselves to be the legitimate grandsons of Bonnie Prince Charlie, Charles Edward Stewart, and later claimed to have been born at Versailles while the king was in residence there in exile. The Sobieski brothers liked to wear Highland dress in full regalia, and they claimed to have a copy of an ancient book of tartan patterns. This is a photograph of Charles Edward Stewart in his full tartan regalia. In 1837, Queen Victoria begins her reign. In 1838, Charles Dickens published Oliver Twist. In 1842, the Sobieski brothers published a book called The Vestiarium Scoticum, which contained many, and I quote, newly discovered old clan tartans. The book was purported to be a 1721 manuscript that was a copy of a 1571 manuscript. And they must have been extraordinarily persuasive because they talked their way into the castle in Edinburgh, into a house on the castle grounds that they lived in, I think, for the rest of their lives. And they beavered away for years to create this copy, purportedly copy of this book of ancient patterns. And the interesting thing today is that one of the most used James Scarlett books of tartan patterns that weavers refer to, fully a third of the patterns in there, the source of them is the Vestiarium Scoticum. So these two men, charlatans though they may be, impacted the history of and the design of tartan for the rest of time. So it's an interesting story. Here we have Queen Victoria. And in 1842, Queen Victoria visited Scotland with Prince Albert and began the Victorian phase for Scotland and for tartan. And this is an exhibition of some of Queen Victoria's tartan dresses. And they're really quite striking, quite beautiful. The Victorians brought new colorations and varieties of tartan. At this time, the earliest aniline dyes, chemical dyes, became available, which allowed dyers to create green with a single dye bath rather than 2 or 3 separate processes to come up with the color green. And so the availability of green dyes brought in what are called hunting tartans, which are primarily green and blue, and had not been seen before that time. There was a new fashion of dressing for dinner, which brought in dress tartans, which are predominantly white with smaller areas of tartan patterning. And Victorian rules for mourning led to funeral or mourning tartans, which were done on a sort of grayscale imitation of a colorful tartan. This was a prolific marriage of supply and demand. Jumping forward, after World War I, ancient or old colors were invented based on the idea that old tartans were lighter in color and in hue. And in the 1940s, reproduction colors were brought in, also quite muted, and these were derived from a scrap of tartan cloth found on Culloden Moor that had been soaked in peat for 200 years and was stained as though dyed in strong tea. And I have a quote here that's from written by E.S. Harrison as one of the essays he wrote for the National Association of Scottish Woolen Manufacturers between 1931 and 1956. His essays are gathered in a book called Scottish Woolens, and these pamphlets were sent to tailoring shops that carried Scottish cloth throughout the world, and they were intended to educate and explain the details and fine points of tartan cloth and tweed cloth and many others of the type of cloths that Scottish woolen manufacturers were making and exporting. Anyway, Mr. Harrison says, and I quote, "The number of possible color combinations is bewildering, but it helps sales. If you want one, you can have an ancient tartan that was designed yesterday, or one in modern colors that are older than old colors. If you do not like any of these, you can have a reproduction tartan that is not a reproduction of any tartan. So the fashion intervened, and all kinds of different words and possible designs were created. Clan tartans eventually led to district tartans, so tartans that were designed for a town or a county or an area of Scotland and other parts of the world. And this eventually also led to national tartans. So if you look at the registry of Scottish tartans today, you can find registered tartans for Nova Scotia, for almost every state in the Union of the United States, for the Chattanooga Pipe Band, as well as registered tartans for Japanese businesses, American businesses, schools. Often people design tartans for a wedding. Walt Disney Corporation registered a tartan for the Brave movie, and the Outlander and Stars Enterprise that's making these Outlander series has registered at least 3 different tartans. So it's quite, there's a big pool. It's a big rabbit hole you can go down if you want to have a look. And I want to talk a little bit about the design development of tartans. And this isn't necessarily a historic lineage, but I think it helps people understand what they're looking at. So here we have a portrait with a very simple 2-color tartan. And you'll notice that the design of his kilt and the design of his coat are slightly different, even though the coloration is the same. And this is actually the Rob Roy tartan. Now, most North Americans would look at this and call it a buffalo check, Canadians as well, but it is the registered tartan for Rob Roy. And it shows you that the basis of all tartans is a basic 2-color check with embellishments. So now we have the Erskine Tartan, and this is just a 2-color check, red and green, but there's a pair of thin lines, sometimes called tram lines. There's a pair of green lines going through the red block and a pair of red lines going through the green block. Very simple 2-color, but a little bit more tartany than the Rob Roy. Here we have Barkley hunting tartan, and this is a blue and green check. It has a green hairline going through the blue block and a red hairline going through the red. So a 3-color tartan, but still very, very simple. Here we have a famous portrait of Neil Gao, who was a very, very well-known fiddler, and his family tartan is actually a 3-color tartan. And I would love to have a closer look at this because his trousers look to me like it's a 2-color, but this is the registered Gao tartan, and it's 3 colors. You could look at it as a blue and green tartan that's been opened up with red lines going in the center and also between those blocks. This is a portrait of Cameron, and he's wearing his family tartan. And these portraits, sorry, let me hop back. This is another one of R.R. McKeon's portraits, and we'll see quite a few of them in this section. So here is his family tartan. The green is a little faded, but you get the general idea. A green and red check. The green block has 3 lines of red breaking up that block. The red block just a center line of yellow. This is the Caledonia Tartan, which is a district tartan. And this is, some of these I can't quite read and I don't have in my notes, but this is Chisholm, and here's the Chisholm tartan with, I would say this was a green and red check that's had quite a few embellishments added to it, including this blue line with a white center in it. So we're getting fancier here. This is the Grant tartan. You can kind of see that red and green check that it started with, but it's had a lot of embellishment added to it. This is Mcduff, and here is the Mcduff tartan. This is one of the ones I think I can't read, and another tartan with quite a faded green, but we're getting really fancy here. This is one of my favorite portraits. This is Colquhoun, which is spelled Colquhoun. I also love his tartan trews. The guy has great legs. He's showing them off. and he's wearing a short kilt as a sash. And this is an unusual tartan in that it has black and white. It's just that the white framing of that green block really makes it stand out. It's a very nice tartan. I like this one. Well, I kind of like them all. This is Farquharson, and here it is up close and done at the scale. There's a little, what weavers call a color and weave effect. In the center of the screen, the blue block with the black lines, it has a color effect of weaving that's kind of superimposed on the actual woven structure of the cloth behind it. And now I think we've gotten up to a 5-color tartan here. And you can see a larger representation of that tartan. And this is Clan Hatton, Chattan, the clan of the cat. And this has a single plain red block and then a block next to it with all the colors. Very, very fancy, but also really quite lovely. This is one of the Stewart variations called the Prince Charles Edward Stewart tartan, and it has a single red block and then what I call the whoopee block because all of the color changes are in there. And the tartan you're most familiar with would be a Stewart tartan, the Royal Stewart. You see it particularly at Christmas time on ribbons and clothing, and I've seen it on everything from vests to sweaters to nightgowns to, leashes for your dog, everything you can think of. This is the Black Watch tartan. This is a military tartan or a regimental tartan, and it actually has 3 different blocks. So the origin would be a blue and green check, but one of your blue blocks has a pair of tram lines going through the center and a heavy black border, and the other blue block has 2 pairs of lines closer to the edge with an open center in it. It's a subtle little detail, but it's something that you find in regimental tartans. This is the Nova Scotia district tartan, and I particularly like this for the 2 shades of green. It's a nice subtlety that you find sometimes. And this is the Blue Ridge Spinners and Weavers Guild tartan. It's a modern design that was based on an old tartan, but we changed each of the colors in that tartan. And the selection of colors was based on the logo of the Blue Ridge Spinners and Weavers. So all of the colors seen in this logo appear in this tartan and in relatively similar amounts. And this is a guild that was dissolved in order to create a new guild that could be a 50c3 tax status, and that is the Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge, which succeeded this guild. There are also women's tartans. This is a woman with a kind of a lot of white area and some smaller stripes of color. Some of these are called Airsade sets, bar blankets, or the Spay sets. And that would be a set where the whole piece of the plaid is a solid color, probably undyed sheep's wool, predominantly an off-white color. And the single strip of sequence of colors found in part of a tartan, her family tartan, would be woven into the sides of the cloth and the top and the bottom. So it would be like one big framing of that. This is a more traditional tartan, and a lady's wearing this as a sash. And here we have a woman wearing a small shawl, the typical size of shawl for a peasant working class woman at the time. And this lady is very proudly wearing her great kilt in the same fashion that a man would, except that her fabric is very plainly patterned, just a stripe in it. And this winsome lass is wearing a great kilt as a large cloak. And I couldn't help but include the Tartan Lounge from the Tartan Hotel in Kinloch Leven. I bet this is a dazzling room, right?
Oh, I want to stay there.
I want to see it just once. I'm not sure it's
Have a cup of tea in that lobby, right, Melissa?
Yeah, a cup of tea, and then you'd need something for your headache. Here we have a group of women who are walking cloth. This is a way of wet finishing tweed and blanketing when it comes off the loom to make it thicker and more weatherproof, and so it won't shrink when it gets wet again. And they have taken the long length of cloth off the loom, sewn the short ends together, and wetted it. And yes, stale urine was sometimes used as a wetting agency. And today we would move this around a table and thump it. You'll see that in a minute. But these ladies are using their feet to do this job. I think they're a little more nimble than I could be with my feet, but it's a great old etching. And here is a modern etching. That is my teacher and mentor at the end of the table. His name is Norman Kennedy. He's originally from Aberdeen, Scotland, and he's entirely responsible for an awful lot of what I know about tartan and the history of tartan, although I did do a lot of research. And this is a photograph taken at the John C. Campbell Folk School, where I teach under normal circumstances 2 or 3 times a year. I have 3 classes scheduled for next year, 2 for this year. And this was a walking that was done in a class. And there are 3 photographs, so you can watch that cloth move. Norman would be in the position of the singer who is singing, but also setting the rhythm with a song that has a steady beat so that everybody can work together. And everyone at the table is grabbing the cloth with their 2 hands. The cloth has been wetted, and thumping it down and passing it on to the next person. So if everyone doesn't work together, that loop of cloth can't progress evenly. And here it is up in the air. So let me back up and do those fast. So here they are getting ready, and then there's a thump, and then a lift, and then it moves on to the next position. And this is a photograph, another walking at the John C. Campbell Folk School. And after the cloth has been finished, it's shrunken maybe somewhere between 8 and 12% in width. And it's smoothed out in the double layer. What we're looking at, the fringy end, is where the 2 short ends of the cloth were stitched together quite roughly, because it's just to hold it together. And the rest of the cloth is smoothed and wound and smoothed on a board, which is then leaned against a wall out of direct sunlight for 24 hours, unwrapped and rewrapped with the outer drier side on the inside and the wetter side on the outside. After 2 days like that, it's dry enough to be hung on a washing line without stretching out of shape. And so here's Norman patting the cloth, and once it's completely wound, he would turn it 3 times clockwise and say some Gaelic prayers that are specific to this type of work. Here he is he's getting ready to turn the bolt of cloth. And this is a little earlier in that same, I guess we're smoothing it out to get ready to wind it. And that's me on his right-hand side. And the woman over my shoulder is Beth Johnston, and I believe she's the person who wove this particular piece of cloth. She would have been at the table for an earlier song, certainly for the first song. It's traditional to have the singer would have the weaver at their right side, and Norman always says this to me. I assume it's true, that someone dear to your heart would sit at your left side on your heart side. At least that's what he says when he places me there. This is a picture of some women collecting crottle or lichen from rocks for dyeing in the Highlands. This is a woman with her dye pot, half of an oil can over an open fire, and she's got fleece in her hands that she's going to drop in there to dye in the wool. This is a woman who has a much more sophisticated setup, a great big cast iron pot and a nice windbreak. So she's got a deluxe spot to do her dyeing. And here we have King Edward, who was responsible for one of the relatively more recent fashion crazes for tartan. And we're going to look at a few members of the royal family, Prince Charles in all of his regalia as a very young man, as Prince of Wales. Here we have the royal family, all in their various tartans at Balmoral Castle. And I couldn't resist including the Queen Mum. May God rest her soul, partially because there are corgis in this picture, and we've had a corgi in our family for many, many years, but I also love these subtle little uses of tartan. So on the left, she's got a tartan kilted skirt, but she's also got tartan on her lapels. In the center, she's at a formal event, but she's wearing a tartan sash, and the suit on the right, another tartan skirt, but she's got lovely insets on her lapels and pockets. So I thought those were quite nice. Here we have Sean Connery, who was the parade leader for the a parade in Philadelphia one year. and doesn't he look handsome in his tartan? And then the pipe band would have matching, the pipe band would have its own tartan. This is one of the first tartan classes I taught at the John C. Campbell Folk School. And here are all the students happy with their finished goods at the end of class. And we were weaving dance stoles in this class, so they're a wider and have longer fringe than a scarf warp would have. And then we have a few instances of tartan in more modern fashion, and some of them are kind of extraordinary. I kind of like these three guys, though, in their tight pants. And Vivian Westwood is one of the designers who's known for using tartan in some really in creative ways. This is a dance company and this was the costuming for, I believe it was a presentation of Petrushka. And this is a picture from a village in Africa. And so tartan may have originated with the Celts, but I also like to think of it as a good idea that a lot of different weavers had in different parts of the world. If you had a bunch of small quantities of lots of colors, this would be the perfectly natural way to put all those colors together to make cloth. I love this picture. It's exciting in many ways, the fabric, but also the energy of their dancing, and it's delightful. And this is the end. No sheep were harmed in the making of this photograph. I'm pretty sure it's Photoshopped.
How was that done?
It's been kicking around the internet for at least 10 years, but it's really fun.
Oh
and yes, good. The slide is right where it was supposed to be. So this is my contact information. If you're interested in receiving a list of tartan books, some of which are specifically weaving, but some are more general, and they're in different sections. You can email me and I'll be happy to send you my list of tartan resources that I give to my students. And this is the link for the Fiber Guild of the Blue Ridge, who co-sponsored this program. And yes. I assume you know how to find the Loudoun County Library website, because that's how you got here.
library.loudoun.gov.
Great.
And let's see, Rose would like to say something. Rose, I just unmuted your microphone.
Oh, I just wanted to say that this was a very, very interesting and entertaining lecture. I was enthralled the whole time. Thank you so much.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you.
And let's see, Kathy. Oops, I think she got, oh, no, she must have done it by mistake. That was fascinating. Does anybody have any questions? Please either let me know you'd like to be unmuted, or you can just type them in the chat box. Melissa, I'm sorry if I missed it, but how many tartan patterns are there?
Oh,
can you say?
There are tens of thousands. I haven't looked at the Scottish Registry of Tartan. I'm sure they have a number for the total registered tartans, but it's an astonishing amount. And then, if I can pull it up real quick.
Families, before they chose their pattern or whatever, you know, I mean, do two families have the same pattern? Can that happen?
Well, people wove tartan. They created their patterns based on the colors that were available to them. Eventually, they intentionally had a pattern that was identified as their own, but they weren't really considered to have names attached to them until well after the Prohibition, after the Battle of Culloden in 1745. So my teacher, for instance, says that Kennedy was one of the very few named tartans that existed before Culloden. I haven't done any research to look that up. And Scottish people are known for being colorful storytellers. And so I withhold judgment on that statement. But if you look at a book like the 1815 Wilson Key Pattern book, there's a facsimile edition available with a nice long introduction that has a lot of information in it. There are no Stewart tartans listed there, whereas that's the most widely known tartan, at least in North America today.
Yeah.
And there are a number of named tartans. And the other thing that's interesting about it is people tend to think that if they're going to weave a tartan, it has to be exactly the right colors and that you have to use exactly the right number of threads in each section. But in fact, in Wilson's key pattern book, there are multiple versions of a single named tartan, and they're not perfectly ratioed mathematically. They're not exactly a half or a third. It's a relative pattern rather than a pattern that's written in stone.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I think if my family had a pattern, I would wear it all the time.
Well, we don't really have a type of dress or fabric that would identify us in that way. That's just not a feature of our society.
No, but if I came from a Scottish family and they had one, I would wear it all the time.
You would have socks and hair ribbons and
Everything.
everything.
Everything. Rose, did you want to say something?
Yes, I wanted to say that very interestingly, my brother, maybe 15 years ago, registered a tartan for our name, and he has the pattern and everything, and he got it. I don't know how he got it woven, but he got it woven, and he gave us all a sample of it. So we actually have one. Isn't that odd?
That's very cool.
Yeah, very, very cool.
What's your last name, if you don't mind?
Oh, sure, it's IJAZ.
IJAZ. Okay,
I
I'll have to
know we're
look for that
from
one.
the Indian subcontinent, so isn't that funny?
Oh, that is really cool.
That's
People
really cool.
identify with tartan from all kinds of different cultures. It's really interesting, the appeal of the cloth. And of course, some people could, they don't like it at all. Um, I have been commissioned to weave fabric for someone who was registering a tartan. So there are weavers out there, and people apparently find them. So it's interesting. Tartan weaving is one of the most popular classes I teach, and it's really, really fun. And I'll just say this one last thing, that when you're weaving tartan, you wind a warp with sometimes very bright colors, and you think, oh dear, this is going to be a bit too much for me, or you're just not sure. But when you weave the same colors across that bright colored warp, there's sections where a red weaves across red, and you get a red square there. But all the way the rest of the colors in that stripe, that red is blending with those colors. And so you do have these clear sections of solid color, but you have a lot of blended, kind of from a distance, a heathered look. And as you're weaving, you're like mixing colors and making solid spots. And for a weaver who loves color, I always feel like I'm about 5. I'm throwing the shuttle line and I'm going, oh, that's so pretty. And then I change colors and I weave and I go, oh, that's so pretty. It's just
That's the beauty of it,
absurdly
though, right?
satisfying. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
the
beautiful.
way the colors interact with each other, and yeah,
Yeah.
it's really fascinating. Melissa, tell us a little bit about the folk school that you attend. You
Oh, I'd be
mentioned
happy to.
sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's in Brasstown, North Carolina. It's about 2.5 hours southwest of Asheville, North Carolina. So it's right in the Smoky Mountains. It
Beautiful
was
area.
started in, I think, the 1920s, and it was part of a wave of after the Civil War, a lot of well-meaning Northerners went into Appalachia to try to help the poor people of Appalachia. And some of them were more well-meaning than knowledgeable, but some of them really did a lot of investigating about what skills were there, what skills were being lost, and how they might best help maintain these craft traditions. And the Campbell Folk School is based on a Danish folk school tradition that somehow fit right in to the mountains of Appalachia. And they started out teaching basic weaving, basket making, woodworking, blacksmithing skills to people in this community where a lot of those skills had been lost, either due to loss of men through war, through just poverty. People couldn't afford their tools, sold off their tools. Lots of things happened that led people to lose these skills. And so they really reintroduced or really strengthened the traditions, and hand weaving was a big part of that, hand spinning, dyeing, and weaving. And today they teach classes, I think, 50 weeks out of the year under ordinary circumstances. And they have an incredible variety of classes, including
Wow.
things that are not hands-on crafts, but things like photography and writing memoirs. A really
Oh,
interesting variety of classes. And they reopened on May 1st with very reduced class sizes and a lot of precautions. There are plexiglass barriers in all the studios that you can
oh,
move to a proper place. They now have cameras and overhead monitors, and which are actually exciting for any time, because if you've ever been in a craft class, it's often hard to get the view you want of the teacher's hands.
right.
So now they have some tools that are really going to enhance this, while we're still considering the pandemic, but also in the future. So they're right now, I've heard that they're going to be enlarging class sizes. So if you're interested and you look at the website and see that some classes may have been sold out, I would call the folk school and talk to them about what's changes that are coming soon.
Can you spell the name of the school?
It's the John C. Campbell, Campbell,
Oh, okay.
Folk School, and their website is just folkschool.org. That will get you there. And they have a catalog for crafters. It's like getting the Sears Wish Book when we were little kids.
Yeah.
Couples often work hard to find a week when there's something they both want to take. But you can
Right.
also bring someone as a guest, if they're happy to hang out and read books or knit or whatever. Go antiquing in the nearby areas. It's a beautiful
Sounds
place.
marvelous.
The food's
Yeah.
always been really good. Oh, they also have great cooking classes, open hearth cooking, and more
Oh,
conventional cooking. So yeah, definitely check out folkschool.org.
I was going to ask you about that if they had cooking classes. Oh, it sounds wonderful. Thanks for
Yeah.
letting us know about that.
I'll be teaching a tartan weaving class there for their Scottish week this year, which is the last week of August, first week of September. But I know that class is full. And in December, I'm teaching a class with my friend Martha Owen, who's the resident in spinning, dyeing, and knitting there. And we're going to be doing spinning, dyeing, and weaving, and probably some knitting, and storytelling and singing. So it should be really fun. And it's for
That sounds like a lot
absolute
of fun.
beginning level spinners and or weavers. You don't need any experience at all. And we're going to repeat that class in 2022. So
That's hopeful that you don't need any experience.
yes, they have a lot of entry level classes.
I think, Rose, did you have another comment? Oh, she's muted again. Sorry.
Oh, no, I'm all set. I'm just listening. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And Melissa, you're going to do another class on knitting.
A program on traditional knitting.
Traditional knitting, yes.
Right.
And I'm just looking up when that's going to be.
I was going to say, do you have the date in front of you?
I will in a second. Everybody just hold on for a second.
It's in August.
It is.
I know
It
that.
is on August 11th at 6:30.
Right.
So please join us for that as well.
And we'll be looking at knitting traditions from England, Ireland, and Scotland
Some
in a
beautiful,
historical context.
yeah, there's some beautiful sweaters in that presentation. All right, thank you all. Have a pleasant evening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me.